Thank you all so very much for joining us here for the El Paso History Radio Show, airing in this pre-recorded episode on News Radio 690 KTSM. I am your host, Andrew J. Polk. Thank you for tuning in, however you may be doing so, be it on air, online, live streaming through the free and reliable iHeartRadio app, or joining us over on the various social media pages we're up on these days, including Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, and Twitch, either under El Paso History, El Paso History TV, or Andrew J. Polk. And today is Saturday, December 10th, and today we are talking about some of the hidden histories, particularly in South and South-Central El Paso, including some things that have come frequent and topics from before the Civil War and Alameda, the Coliseum, as well as some upcoming tours to view parts of this history. So delving into a lot of issues there and a lot of topics here. Of course, can find us on air, online, streaming on KTSMradio.com is one of the more simple internet portals. But again, the full video, El Paso History Radio Show Facebook page and YouTube channel, as well as on our partner Facebook pages, Remember in El Paso, when the group there. This is, of course, the place where we say Texas history begins in El Paso. To have a history moment at the top of hour two from documentary filmmaker Jackson Polk, talking about some other aspects of our local history. But again, joining us here in studio today, we are joined by Dr. David Dorado Romo, El Paso historian focused on Borderlands and the US-Mexico region. So thank you very much for joining us here today.
No, thank you for inviting me.
Absolutely happy to have you on to talk about some interesting different aspects of it, because while it's always enticing to be able to go and look at what is still there, I mean, the sense of place and history you can get from a place here, but the fact of the matter is, any community that has been around for, well, anything besides new construction often has a lot of things that may not actually be visible anymore, but the history is still there. The way it informs the present is always very engaging for me here. So that's something that you're interested in focus on, and particularly it's a couple of corridors we're going to be talking about here today, including specifically, I mean, Alameda is an interesting one, and that's we were talking before the show how my experience on there has been, looking for cheap used cars here, because there's a lot of car lots down there. But it was not, of course, always that way. I mean, you would have been very surprised to have found a cheap used car lot back in, say, 1900. It would not have been there.
Right, that's right.
So there's a lot of interesting different aspects of it here, including things such as the Coliseum, the performances that have happened there, the creation of it, as well as, again, Segundo Barrio and those areas in general. So when you start tackling issues like this, I mean, where do you even start whenever you're looking at some of these parts of history that particularly are no longer visible because edifices, those kind of things, are no longer there?
Right. Well, I actually, there's still a lot of buildings that still exist in South Central. For instance, Alameda Street some of those buildings go back to, say, 1908, that church right there, the Guardian Angel Church, that's from 1908.
Oh, okay.
So Washington Park, most people wouldn't know it, but that became a semi-city. It was owned by the city since the 1890s.
Mm-hmm.
So that was one of the first swimming pools, 1906. So you have a Camp Concordia or Rancho Concordia. Well, you have a cemetery, right?
Of course.
So there are still vestiges in terms of physical aspects, because that's usually how I start. I start by looking just at everything that happened in the Coliseum, and that provides a kind of window to much deeper histories.
All right, let's jump in with that one then, because that's, of course, the County Coliseum. People may be very familiar with being a performance venue and where a lot of stuff happens these days. I guess I had heard about it being established as a livestock exhibition building here in this, I want to say this is from the Herald Post, back at that point in time when it was actually being created, a very interesting rendition of it there, and you don't really see that side of it anymore since you're going around the back and the other parts. But you see this when you're driving by on Alameda still currently, though.
Paisano Street.
Paisano, right? Sorry, yes. That's on Paisano, right. That is the side that you see here, even though there's a lot more, in the modern currents of it here, a lot more around it these days.
That's right. So the Coliseum was built in 1942, right? Basically at the start of World War II. It has a fascinating history in terms of World War II. It was used as a POW camp for Italian prisoners of war. And the reason they brought him here is because during the Bracero agreement between Mexico and the United States,
right,
Mexico refused to send any braceros to Texas because of its systemic discrimination against both Mexican residents and Mexican Americans. So the local cotton growers especially desperately needed hired labor. And so that's why they brought in the POWs. Later, when that boycott from Mexico was no longer in place, and we're talking about 1950, then it did serve as a bracero reception center. So it has a whole bunch of history other than what we know it as a sports venue, as a place for the ice capades, for instance.
Where I used to go and see the Buzzards play back in the day here, voiced by Paul Strells in here. So there's a lot of history in there, but again, it's the hidden aspects of it, the parts that are in like places like that more transient and not really a permanent fixture of it that are more interest to you, essentially.
Yeah, so one of the things that comes up there, I hadn't read too much of the specifics of segregation at the Coliseum.
Mm-hmm.
So you had all these wonderful jazz musicians. I mean, the first major act that comes in the 40s, like in 46, was Duke Ellington.
Yep.
And then later you have Dizzy Gillespie. Then you have blues jazz musicians, other blues musicians, like, oh my God, everybody from, I'm thinking, well, later the Jackson 5 are there. Chuck Berry, Elvis is there as well. He's not a black musician, but so what happens at that time is that blacks and whites are allowed to be in the same dance floor while these jazz musicians are playing these big bands, but they're not allowed to cross over. So you have like a line, sometimes chairs, down the middle of the Coliseum, and so these were mixed dances. But there was always a segregated space in most events for African Americans. They had to sit in a group in a designated space. What happens is in 1949, you have an independent party, the Progressive Party. And this was Henry Wallace. He comes to the Coliseum and makes a big deal about the segregation. He says, I am not going to go speak to El Paso if you separate African Americans from whites or have a designated area for them. And the county commissioners said, well, we've always done that. And so they didn't want to. The county commissioners at that time did not want to make a big deal. So they voted to not decide. And so what ended up happening was that you had Henry Wallace with the support of a pretty significant sector of the Mexican American community and the African American community that like pushed for desegregating the Coliseum. And so for that one event, it was desegregated. But the local newspapers were saying, this guy's a communist, he's a rabble-rouser, they red baited him, right? So that's the first instance that I said, wow, I hadn't read too much about black-brown solidarity in El Paso against racial segregation. Have you read any books on that?
No, that's not been one that came up in my coming up in EPISD schools and local El Paso schools. You get one year on Texas history, and at that point in time there was one chapter on El Paso, and it starts with El Paso is an arid desert area that gets about 11 inches of rain per year. That's yes. How it starts here. I remember that very vividly. So no, just short answer, no. It did not get into that.
So and now we hear that El Paso was at the forefront in terms of the 1966 UTEP team, right? There were, you would say that El Paso was at the forefront of racial integration, and it's usually most people concentrate in 1962 on the local kind of white progressive politicians, but they don't realize that one of the reasons that it made it easier for these white progressive politicians to push for segregation back in the 1960s is because from the very beginning, South El Paso and South-Central El Paso, which at that time was considered East El Paso, everything basically east of Cotton Street would have been considered East El Paso. Yeah,
just like, the McGoffin home used to be out in the boonies, basically. I mean, the definition of what is east in comparison to downtown has always been kind of shifted, and I mean it's a little bit nebulous. I mean, old news director of mine would argue that Lower Valley starts with the first blade of grass at Escalate at this point here, those kind of considerations here, and middle of Airway is where the east side starts here, but now we got all these phrases such as far east or even northwest that I'm still getting used to, so those concepts certainly change over time.
So, for instance, Concordia would have been 3 miles east. Concordia Cemetery would have been 3 miles east of El Paso, because once again, the boundaries around 1910 would have been Cotton Street. Those were the boundaries. So later, say by 1940, it extends to what is now Valverde Concepcion, which is kind of where Jefferson High School is today. So, so mostly in the newspapers, they would have called that area East El Paso at that time. And so you find this color line distinction kind of spread out in places you wouldn't expect. For instance, Washington Park had one of the first public swimming pools in El Paso, and they drew the color line. So a lot of people know of Dr. Nixon. I think we have a picture of him there. So he won 2 Supreme Court cases, U.S. Supreme Court cases, trying to allow African Americans to vote in the Democratic primaries. So very well known kind of local civil rights leader on the voting. But few people know that he was pushing for a segregated, quote unquote, Negro, in the language of that day, a Negro swimming pool in Washington Park. And the mayor, who had just won against the KKK back around that time, 24, said no, absolutely not. But I'll promise you something: we can build it in the Segundo Barrio, because the Segundo Barrio is already integrated among Mexican Americans and African Americans. And we don't care; we can build it over there. So the Segundo Barrio had the only 2 movie theaters that were not segregated. The African Americans could sit with everyone, and that was El Colón, and the other one was the Alcázar, which was right across the street. And those were in El Paso Street and what is today Paisano Street, pretty much.
I think I got a picture of one of those here. No, this is the Mission Theater, one of the ones that open up later here. Picture we got up there from a newspaper article at the time as well. Right.
Yeah, that one has its own history of itself. That's in Alameda, and also a segregated theater. Right. So those are the stories. Those are the hidden stories of how, for decades, there was no segregation between African Americans
in places and in certain ways.
In places, and there was collaboration. They lived peacefully among each other in ways that you couldn't north of the railroad tracks, which was more or less where Overland Street historically in the early 20th century. You did have racial covenants for like Kern Place. If you wanted to buy a home there, you had to sign an agreement saying, I'm not going to sell this house to an African American, a Jew, Mexican American, right? So they were very strictly segregated. Also, for instance, the theater, the Downtown Plaza Theater, that had a separate entrance for African Americans.
I mean, the balconies in certain areas like that, I mean, you can find a lot of evidence historically in other places, but of course El Paso as well, of why they were formulated in such a way here. I mean, one of the reasons you have balconies, among other things, in some of those original constructions was for separation, essentially, not just a different viewing angle as kind of it serves today.
Right. No, that's really interesting how you see the social dynamics, including the ethnic divisions on the population with structures. And even if you go, of course, I'm sure you know, when you go to Concordia, they had an African American section. So it was segregated, right? The Chinese.
Right, yeah, I was thinking about that, the Chinese section.
The Mexican Catholic, they called it the American Protestant, but American at that time meant white, right? So they had the Jewish section.
Yeah, of course.
So they had about 12 different sections, and a lot of them were definitely based on people's ethnicity and, of course, their class. The county paupers couldn't even afford a headstone, right? So as historians, it's really fascinating to see those divisions
and to delve into those different aspects of the history. So we're going to get into a little bit more about the roots of some of this, including the start of some of these things. We've touched on a lot of different topics that we'll be talking a lot further about here. But again, joining us here in studio right now is David Romo, El Paso historian, focused on Borderlands and U.S. and Mexico history and relations. Talking more about that and more of these subjects after this break. So stay tuned for more on the El Paso History Radio Show here on News Radio 690 KTSM.
You are listening to the El Paso History Radio Show, streaming on Facebook, where you can find archive radio programs. The El Paso History Radio Show also streams on the Facebook page Remember in El Paso When, run by Chief Administrator Barbara Gibbon-Baney, known as BGB. Check out that page for thousands of archived pictures and videos of El Paso history. Remember in El Paso When on Facebook. Visit Mission Del Rey Southwest for a huge selection of El Paso souvenirs, decor, and gifts. Mission Del Rey features El Paso saddle blanket products and thousands of Southwest, Native American, and Mexico items, plus unique pottery, blankets, and turquoise jewelry. Bring your family and out-of-town guests to visit Mission Del Rey Southwest's large showroom at Lee Trevino and Pelicano and see their website at missiondelrey.com. 915-440-2140 for souvenirs, gifts, and decor. Mission Del Rey Southwest. Pepe's New Mexican Restaurant and Cantina serves the old Griggs Mexican food recipes in a new location at 6761 Doniphan Drive. Enjoy great New Mexican food with cold beer and the Juan and only margarita from the cantina. The managers and cooks from the original Griggs restaurant serve tacos, combination plates, and sopapillas. Get the best Mexican food in the valley at Pepe's New Mexican Restaurant and Cantina, 6761 Doniphan, near Loop 375. Call 877-2152. M1 EP Management Corporation is proud to sponsor the El Paso History Show. If you're tired of the ups and downs of the stock market, invest in real estate. M1 EP manages apartments in El Paso and helps investors buy, hold, and sell property. See the website, m1ep.com. M1ep.com. To learn more about the many benefits and long-term appreciation, call 915-592-4549. 915-592-4549.
Many retired El Paso area homeowners don't know where to begin when it comes to downsizing and selling their home. Patrick Tuttle and his Legacy Home Team follow a proven process to help retired homeowners sell faster and for more money. Call Patrick Tuttle at 915-588-1850 today and get your home sold faster and for more money. That's Patrick Tuttle at 915-588-1850.
Thank you all so very much for joining us here for the El Paso History Radio Show, airing in this pre-recorded episode on News Radio 690 KTSM. I am your host, Andrew J. Polk. Of course, we are the El Paso History Radio Show on Facebook. You can go there for our weekly promo announcements on topics for the upcoming programs each week. Got some best of shows coming up towards the end of the year, but you can still see what we'll be talking about there each week. You can also go to our YouTube channel, youtube.com/El Paso History TV, where you can find, particularly if you don't have a Facebook, a little bit easier to see the live broadcast as we are putting out these new episodes each week, but also some of the previous ones. Again, better if you don't have a login, but also specifically you can see more than just that, including the entire series of El Paso Gold DVDs covering more than the last couple of decades of history production here in town when it comes to videos, plus the uploaded full 20 segments of the ABC7 TV series from El Paso History TV, documenting some interesting sites. I was on the back end a lot on the camera on that one and doing a lot of the editing, so you can see my involvement in that way. Kind of, Bernie was in front of the camera a lot there, but check them out there. Again, that's on youtube.com/El Paso History TV. Also a reminder to support some of our advertisers. Pepe's New Mexican Restaurant in Canutillo is, of course, open for in-house dining, 6761 Doniphan Drive. Simplest way I get there is to go down Talbot, right off of the Loop 375, Trans Mountain, essentially, and just keep going. Turn left, and then Pepe's will be almost immediately on your right, kind of going past the Tamales Lupita area, because they have the great old Griggs recipes kept alive and still able to be, simply purchased as opposed to having to create from scratch for yourself there. You can call Pepe's at 915-877-2152, 915-877-2152, and again, 6761 Doniphan Drive, home of the Juan and only margarita. I will be out there this week as well. Actually, no, I won't be. I'll be out there next week, so check us out then here. Out of town for this coming weekend, but make sure to go out there and support our advertisers. Do appreciate them. But again, joining us here in studio today, we are joined by David Romo, El Paso historian, and focused on some of the aspects of, hidden histories is what we're talking about today, but also kind of US-Mexico and related population relations. So we were mentioning about Concordia Cemetery here, and of course, the concept of that being out of the way here, I mean, just... Right. Anyone who hasn't really paid attention to the growth of El Paso or studied it, which I don't blame anyone, it's not something, again, taught in the schools here. Yeah. It used to be down in the middle of nowhere. That's the reason you put a giant cemetery in a place here is usually, we got a bunch of land, no one's using it. Sure, we'll use it as a burial plot here. It was kind of what happened in downtown El Paso for a while, because that's where, the library is, the downtown library was kind of one of the original plots here, and then the city grew around that, and then that became an issue, so they moved that to Concordia, and now the city has moved around that as well. So that's why it may seem like it was far out there, but now it's literally surrounded by some of the major highway and routes around town here, because that's how it started.
Right. Yeah, the major cemeteries before were right under what is now the library. What was the Old Popular on the corner of San Antonio?
Mm-hmm.
There used to be a Masonic cemetery there. And then kind of near Sunset Heights, there was another cemetery. So Concordia was used as a cemetery after, much later, like probably in the 1880s. So Concordia started in the 1850s as Rancho Concordia.
Mm-hmm.
So it was owned by Hugh Stevenson, who changed his name to Hugo Stevenson after he married Juan Azcárate. And so he basically got this huge tract of land through his father-in-law. And that was a usual tactic that a lot of of these early Anglo settlers would come in and intermarry into the richest family in order to open up their networks and get land in this case. And so Rancho Concordia would have been pretty much where the Concordia Cemetery is today, but it would have included, for instance, a little closer to Alameda as well. Like where the Stevens, the brewery, the old El Paso brewery.
Oh, yeah.
Might recognize that. It would have gone down all the way to like Chelsea Street. So it was huge. And there were 400 people, mostly Mexicans. And he owned, Stevenson owned at least 3 slaves according to the 1860s census. And that was also the site later of Camp Concordia.
Right.
I believe beginning in 1868. Does that sound right to you?
About there. I mean, there was a lot of movement that happened of military facilities in general. Of course, there's the movement of Fort Bliss, McGoffinsville, all those different areas here. But that definitely was, it sounds about right at the time here, before Fort Bliss landed on where it is now, previously known as La Noria Mesa.
Yeah, that's what I remember right now off the top of my head. But after McGoffinsville, Fort Bliss moves. The first site would have been very much near where downtown El Paso is, and Duranguito. It would have been all that area.
The post opposite Paso del Norte at the time,
Right. So Camp Concordia has an interesting history because it was mostly African American soldiers of the 10th Cavalry at that time that were there. And so that goes back to the whole reason why African American soldiers are brought to the Southwest to begin with. So after the Civil War, there were about 200,000 African American soldiers, and the U.S. military did not want to send the African American soldiers to areas mostly populated by whites, because they would have created, because of the racism. So they sent them down. The first group got sent down to Galveston, and so after that, they would have been used to help clear up the lands for the railroads and what have you, and that meant going to Native American communities and placing them on reservations, right, to get them out of the way of quote-unquote progress.
And, of course, we had the histories of Buffalo soldiers also being mentioned there. But also you mentioned some of the history of slavery in the area. Not one that's often talked about as well, but we were a part of Texas. And, of course, Texas was a slave state pre-Civil War here. So, tell you what, we got to talk more about that history. You got to take that next break right now here. So, coming out of this break, more discussion about some of these histories. Again, focusing on hidden histories and aspects of it that can be seen, particularly in South and South-Central El Paso. So, stay tuned for more on the El Paso History Radio Show here on News Radio 690 KTSM.
You are listening to the El Paso History Radio Show, streaming on Facebook, where you can find archived radio programs. The El Paso History Radio Show also streams on the Facebook page Remember in El Paso When, run by Chief Administrator Barbara Gibbon-Bainey, known as BGB. Check out that page for thousands of archived pictures and videos of El Paso history. Remember in El Paso When on Facebook. Visit Mission Del Rey Southwest for a huge selection of El Paso souvenirs, decor, and gifts. Mission Del Rey features El Paso saddle blanket products and thousands of Southwest, Native American, and Mexico items, plus unique pottery, blankets, and turquoise jewelry. Bring your family and out-of-town guests to visit Mission Del Rey Southwest's large showroom at Lee Trevino and Pelicano and see their website at missiondelrey.com. 915-440-2140. for souvenirs, gifts, and decor. Mission Del Rey Southwest. Pepe's New Mexican Restaurant and Cantina serves the old Griggs Mexican food recipes in a new location at 6761 Donovan Drive. Enjoy great New Mexican food with cold beer and the Juan and only margarita from the cantina. The managers and cooks from the original Griggs restaurant serve tacos, combination plates, and sopapillas. Get the best Mexican food in the valley at Pepe's New Mexican Restaurant and Cantina, 6761 Donovan, near Loop 375. Call 877-2152. M1 EP Management Corporation is proud to sponsor the El Paso History Show. If you're tired of the ups and downs of the stock market, invest in real estate. M1 EP manages apartments in El Paso and helps investors buy, hold, and sell property. See the website, m1ep.com. M1EP.
Thank you all so very much for joining us here for the El Paso History Radio Show, airing on News Radio 690 KTSM in this pre-recorded episode. I'm your host, Andrew J. Polk. Got to mention some of our other great partners in talking about different aspects, and particularly some physical aspects of El Paso's history, including, of course, the celebration of our mountains. As long as it's not getting too cold out there, this is, of course, a very good season in order to be able to go out and experience the mountains, the physical landscape, and some of the, I'm not going to call it unnatural, but man-made landscape out there as well, and including some of the hikes that are already going on today as we are airing, including a visiting of the prehistoric trackways discovery site, but even more coming up, say, is later in December, such as the hike up to the B-36 crash site in the Franklin Mountains. They got a whole schedule of events there, so check them out and see what they got going on for you. Again, celebrationofourmountains.org, or just search it on your favorite search engine if that name is a little bit too long to make sure you're spelling it right here. Again, celebrationofourmountains.org. But again, joined here in studio right now by Dr. David Dorado Romo, El Paso historian, focused on the borderlands and particularly U.S. and Mexico and the relations between it and the communities involved with it here, and particularly talking about today hidden histories, things that are maybe not as well noted or really visible anymore, including theaters that don't exist, as well as, ways kind of communities developed along, say, the Alameda corridor is one we'll be focusing on a lot here today, though we've also mentioned Paisano, of course, a couple of times here. And so one of the interesting things that is not often talked about here is the history of slavery in its own way here in El Paso, because, I mean, it makes even a certain base level of sense if you think about it. El Paso, part of Texas, and Texas, I mean, the reason it joined the Confederacy was because it was a slaveholding state here. So this definitely was a possibility here, even if we're not talking about maybe the way it was considered for the rest of the quote-unquote South, of, big plantations, because that didn't exist to that extent here, but of course it was still legally possible, and there is evidence within the record of, small holdings, those kind of things.
That's right. And most people probably have never read about the history of slavery in El Paso. You just assume it wasn't there. It's definitely not something they teach you in the local high schools.
Oh, no, that one definitely doesn't come up here because,
schools, right?
I mean, plantations and things like that are mentioned in kind of the rest of Texas history.
Right.
And the fact that, you want to go back to the founding of Texas as the concept here, as it was the, seeking settlement colony, as it was the Coahuila, Texas, back in the, Spanish and then later on Mexican colonial history, particularly the Mexican efforts of trying to draw in, Anglo settlers that was part of the enticement of kind of the expansion of it there, at least from, some more of the advertisements and the, hey, come here, use this land that we're not really, or we want to see more settled in this way kind of thing from the Mexican government perspective.
So El Paso in the 1860 census has 15 slaves, which is small compared to other Texas towns. And so 3 of them are owned by Hugh Stevenson, a 36-year-old woman who was categorized as black in the census, and then 2 children categorized as mulatto. The other major elite Anglo in this part of the world at that time was Hart, John. I'm forgetting his first name.
But Hart is in Hart's Mill.
Yeah,
right?
Hart's Mill, right? Simeon Hart, I'm sorry.
Right.
Simeon Hart. So the census lists him with owning 5 enslaved people. And so one of them was Charles Hart. They would give him their own name, 46 years old.
Right.
Sally Hart, who was 48 years old. Patsy Hart, 22 years old. And an unnamed female mulatto, which is the word that they would use for mixed race people. And a 6-month-old infant named Charles, also classified as mulatto. So why the reason for such a relatively small number of enslaved people? Well, because of Mexican solidarity. what do I mean by that? Well, Mexico had declared slavery illegal. They had abolished slavery in 1829. Who did it? It was Vicente Guerrero. He was Mexico's first mixed-race African, a person of African descent. Basically, Mexico's first black president, Justice Obama, was 177 years later. He declares slavery illegal. And of course, the Texians, as the white Texans called themselves at the time, were very upset because they needed enslaved people. They needed slavery in order to make any kind of profit in their cotton farms.
I mean, that was the system that had, again, been set up as part of the expansion of settlement efforts. Again, we're talking what we would now consider essentially East Texas, the primary part of what was considered Texas at the time.
So it's called, when Texas declares its quote-unquote independence from Mexico, I would call it a secession, because really slavery was a major driving force for why the Texians wanted to be independent from Mexico. Because usually when you use the word independence, you're talking about people that have lived there for hundreds of years. A lot of these Texians were recent immigrants who had moved into Texas without permission from the Mexican government, and and a lot of them came specifically as mercenaries, like say James Bowie, for instance, right? He was a slave smuggler. So the slavery issue was major for Texas, and that's why they chose to secede from Mexico at that time.
It is interesting the way you put it, secede, because it's the 1824 flag is one of the ones that comes up in the Texas Revolutionary history of being as it is essentially what we would consider modern Mexican flag. It has 1824 in the middle. And essentially the point of that banner was at that point in time that, no, we're not, again, from the band that was supporting it of the Texas Revolutionaries, came to be Texas Revolutionaries, of we are calling ourselves in support of the Constitution at 1824, which we settled under, essentially was the argument, which, among other things, allowed for the establishment of the system of slavery that they had at that point in time.
Right. So they saw it as a betrayal for some of those initial concessions that the Mexican government made to them. But if you argue that there were other reasons, decentralization and what have you, it sounds very much like the arguments that the South did not secede over slavery from the Union, that it seceded over, individual state rights. Same argument that was used for the secession against the United States and the Union. So you could say that Texas was the first and only state in what is now the United States to have seceded twice in the name of the institution of slavery, right? But that's another thing they don't teach you in the schools, or at least discuss that perspective. So getting back to why it was so hard for slavery to thrive on the borderlands. Well, because the border was so close. It was very easy to just walk down there. And so all of us know about Harriet Tubman and the Underground Railroad up to Canada. But how many people have studied the fact that there were thousands of enslaved African Americans that also escaped, but to the other railroad, the other Underground Railroad, to Mexico, with the help of Tejanos and Fronterizos, Mexican Americans, people of Mexican descent, that sometimes risked their own lives by hiding them in churches and taking them to Mexico. That's a story that's never been told, right? So there was an alliance between brown and black people at that time period. And the white power structure at that time didn't like that. They said, this is dangerous. So a lot of Mexicanos were kicked out of towns, including Austin, all over Central Texas, because they were seen as somehow subversive, that they were subverting the institution of slavery. So that was used as an excuse to displaced massive groups of ethnic Mexicans from Texas, Tejanos. So when you come here to El Paso, there was this really fascinating case that I was looking through some of the old archives, and this happens in 1859. And I was finding, while I was looking at some of the UTEP archives. So a free Mexican Negro servant, quote unquote, successfully sued his white American employer for $14 worth of back wages in an El Paso del Norte court. That was what Ciudad Juarez was called back then. The former employer, who lived in Franklin, which is what El Paso was called, was so indignant about the Mexican court's verdict that he organized a posse of 8 white men who attempted to abduct the formerly enslaved black fronterizo from the steps of the courthouse. And armed Mexicans from El Paso del Norte came to his defense. They forced the interlopers back to the river, where they were arrested by Mexican authorities and thrown in jail. So I just found that whole incident just fascinating, right? Of the time, the kind of division between one side of the border to the other. So that's part of our hidden history here, this underground railroad to Mexico, and the role of solidarity that Mexican Americans showed to the African enslaved population in Texas. And so that's that story. So how does the Camp Concordia come into that? Well, there was a deliberate attempt to divide brown from black people. So the white military is telling African Americans, if you want the privileges of citizenship, you got to show it, and you got to prove it by helping to dispossess Native Americans. And there were cases, I read some of the oral histories of these Buffalo soldiers that said, we had to capture a young Apache girl, 17 years old, and she kept trying to escape. And in one case, she tried to pull our guns, and we had to kill her. And we did. We shot her, and we didn't say anything afterwards. Kind of like, we know that this is the job we got to do. We're not too happy about it. We don't have the same kind of racism against Native people as the whites at that time. But if we want the privileges of citizenship, this is our job. We're just doing our job, type of thing, right? So in 1877, what happens? The Salt War. So that's about the privatization of communal property, right? Mexicanos have lost so many lands that were promised to them under the Spanish land grant system. So there were these salt mines not too far from here.
Yeah, the salt flats that most notably recently flooded a couple of summers ago when we had the heavy rains here. And then people kept going out and visiting. And if you're going to do that, don't cross a fence, because then you are on someone that had to be the sheriff called out there most recently. But at that point in time, that was not even just a piece of land. I mean, it would be probably by modern day considerations considered bad land, like not useful, not able to produce anything. But at that point in time, it was actually an incredibly vital resource, because salts, I mean, you want to go back into the historical aspects of it, the phrase salary comes from the idea of the payment of salt. That's how important it is, because for refrigeration, what are you going to do with that? It wouldn't be a nice juicy steak, but what are you going to do with any of your beef? You're not going to, you're either going to keep it on the hoof, so to speak, or you're going to salt the heck out of it in order to preserve it, among other preservation methods. But salt was more or less the simplest among other preservation systems. So it was essential to not even just everyday life, but also to burgeoning industry in the area. Like, it was essential to be able to go out there and gather that. So tell you what, we'll talk more about that here in the next segment. Got to take that next break right now, because that's an interesting bit of our history as well. And we talked about the Salt War on a few different occasions here. So stay tuned for more on the El Paso History Radio Show after this next break here on News Radio 690 KTSM.
You are listening to the El Paso History Radio Show, streaming on Facebook, where you can find archived radio programs. The El Paso History Radio Show also streams on the Facebook page Remember in El Paso When, run by Chief Administrator Barbara Gibbon-Bainey, known as BGB. Check out that page for thousands of archived pictures and videos of El Paso history. Remember in El Paso When on Facebook. Visit Mission Del Rey Southwest for a huge selection of El Paso souvenirs, decor, and gifts. Mission Del Rey features El Paso saddle blanket products and thousands of Southwest, Native American, and Mexico items, plus unique pottery, blankets, and turquoise jewelry. Bring your family and out-of-town guests to visit Mission Del Rey Southwest's large showroom at Lee Trevino and Pelicano, and see their website at missiondelrey.com. 915-440-2140 for souvenirs, gifts, and decor. Mission Del Rey Southwest. Pepe's New Mexican Restaurant and Cantina serves the old Griggs Mexican food recipes in a new location at 6761 Doniphan Drive. Enjoy great New Mexican food with cold beer and the one and only margarita from the cantina. The managers and cooks from the original Griggs restaurant serve tacos, combination plates, and sopapillas. Get the best Mexican food in the valley at Pepe's New Mexican Restaurant and Cantina, 6761 Doniphan, near Loop 375. Call 877-2152. M1 EP Management Corporation is proud to sponsor the El Paso History Show. If you're tired of the ups and downs of the stock market, Invest in real estate. M1EP manages apartments in El Paso and helps investors buy, hold, and sell property. See the website, m1ep.com. M1ep.com. To learn more about the many benefits and long-term appreciation, call 915-592-4549. 915-592-4549.
Many retired El Paso area homeowners don't know where to begin when
Thank you all so very much for joining us here for Talk El Paso, airing live on News Radio 690 KTSM. I'm your host, Andrew J. Polk. One quick reminder to talk to some of our other great partners in different aspects of El Paso's history, including the musical aspect of it. Rick Kern's music podcast, Talk and Rock Radio. You can visit him at talkandrockradio.com, talking about some of the other, older acts and some of the early days of rock and roll coming through town here. He has some remembrances and some production of it. You might remember him from doing the Border Legends tour, among other things. And so talkandrockradio.com, so we can find some of his current podcasts going on and talking with some of the people that he has worked with and known and remembered over the years. So again, talk and rockradio.com, so you can find them. Also want to remind you about some of our other great sponsors here, including Patrick Tuttle, Coldwell Banker, Heritage Real Estate. Call 915-588-1850 for Patrick Tuttle. Excellent realtor. Him and his team have done a lot of great work for my family as well, including the house that we are currently in. So go to them for El Paso homes for sale or rent. Again, Patrick Tuttle, Coldwell Banker, Heritage Real Estate, 915-588-1850. That's 915-588-1850. But again, joining us here in studio right now, we do have David Romo, a local historian focused on some of the interesting hidden history aspects that we're getting into here, including, of course, the history of slavery and the way that it existed here in town here, that, of course, informs some of the later interactions that you've also been investigating and interested in looking at.
Right. So we were talking about the Salt Wars. The African-American soldiers, the Buffalo Soldiers, were sent by the U.S. military after there was a huge, some people have described it as a kind of a race war, because the local population, the fronterizo population, they were used to these communal land grants, and also, for instance, water was free. You know, you had the irrigation acequia system, and it wasn't until after the railroads that water was privatized, including the Franklin Canal. You would have to pay to get your fields irrigated, and so was salt. Right, and salt was super important.
Oh yeah, it was a standard of life at that point.
So there was an uprising, and that was and the local population from both sides of the border rose up against basically the Anglo establishment here. They brought in the Texas Rangers, and the fronterizos defeated the Texas Rangers. They say for the first time in history, and one of the only times, if not the only time, that had happened. And so the African American soldiers were sent to keep the peace, right? So they kept the peace, but what was interesting is that they also there were some retaliations afterwards by the Texas Rangers, and they played a role in making sure that the Texas Rangers didn't violate the law. So that, you know, the African American soldiers had an interesting, they knew that they were being used, I think, and being pit against other brown people in order to be granted their privileges, but they knew that it was tenuous. It was kind of a liminal. You're sent to the front lines. You're sent to the front lines to fight for white America, but they don't always treat you that well when you come back. And maybe we'll talk about this a little later, but that happened also during the Mexican revolutions.
Right, and you've got some specific examples we can look at there as well here. But again, looking at some of these hidden histories, and particularly the histories of the communities that can still be seen in its own ways, we'll also be getting into that in the next hour of the program here, but getting pretty well close up to needing to take that break for that next hour right now. So again, joining us here in studio, Dr. David Dorado Romo, El Paso historian, focused on the Borderlands and some of these relations here. So stay tuned for more on the El Paso History Radio Show in the next hour here on News Radio 690 KTSM. Stay tuned.
You are listening to the El Paso History Radio Show, streaming on Facebook, where you can find archived radio programs. The El Paso History Radio Show also streams on the Facebook page Remember in El Paso When, run by Chief Administrator Barbara Gibbon-Bainey, known as BGB. Check out that page for thousands of archived pictures and videos of El Paso history. Remember in El Paso When on Facebook. Visit Mission Del Rey Southwest for a huge selection of El Paso souvenirs, decor, and gifts. Mission Del Rey features El Paso saddle blanket products and thousands of Southwest, Native American, and Mexico items, plus unique pottery, blankets, and turquoise jewelry. Bring your family and out-of-town guests to visit Mission Del Rey Southwest's large showroom at Lee Trevino and Pelicano and see their website at missiondelrey.com. 915-440-2140 for souvenirs, gifts, and decor. Mission Del Rey Southwest. Pepe's New Mexican Restaurant and Cantina serves the old Griggs Mexican food recipes in a new location at 6761 Doniphan Drive. Enjoy great New Mexican food with cold beer and the one and only margarita from the cantina. The managers and cooks from the original Griggs restaurant serve tacos, combination plates, and sopapillas. Get the best Mexican food in the valley at Pepe's New Mexican Restaurant and Cantina, 6761 Doniphan near Loop 375. Call 877-2152. M1 EP Management Corporation is proud to sponsor the El Paso History Show. If you're tired of the ups and downs of the stock market, invest in real estate. M1 EP manages apartments in El Paso and helps investors buy, hold, and sell property. See the website, m1ep.com. M1ep.com. To learn more about the many benefits and long-term appreciation, call 915-592-4549. 915-592-4549.
Many retired El Paso area homeowners don't know where to begin when it comes to downsizing and selling their home. Patrick Tuttle and his legacy home team follow a proven process to help retired homeowners sell faster and for more money. Call Patrick Tuttle at 915-588-1850 today and get your home sold faster and for more money. That's Patrick Tuttle at 915-588-1850. Call him today.
The El Paso History Radio Show also streams on Saturday mornings on our YouTube channel, El Paso History TV. Go to youtube.com/El Paso History TV for archives of the El Paso History Radio Show. Also on that YouTube channel, you can see for free many other videos, documentaries, and lectures about El Paso area history at youtube.com/El Paso History TV. Additionally, watch a dozen TV documentaries about El Paso history for free there on our YouTube channel. This includes Legends of El Paso's Mountains, Gunfights of the Old West, El Paso's Waco Tanks, Mexican Revolution sites in El Paso, and 8 more TV documentaries produced by El Paso filmmaker Jackson Polk since 2001. And at youtube.com/El Paso History TV, you can watch for free 20 short videos we produced that were broadcast on ABC7 KVIA TV newscasts. This series is called El Paso History TV and features Spanish missions and churches on El Paso's Mission Trail, plus the Guadalupe Mission in Juarez, Mexico. That church was built in 1659 and is the oldest known adobe building on the El Paso Juarez Valley. It still welcomes Catholic worshipers today. Go to El Paso History TV on youtube.com. You are listening to the El Paso History Radio Show streaming on Facebook, where you can find archive radio programs. The El Paso History Radio Show also streams on the Facebook page Remember in El Paso When, run by Chief Administrator Barbara Gibbon-Bainey, known as BGB. Check out that page for thousands of archived pictures and videos of El Paso history. Remember in El Paso When on Facebook. Visit Mission Del Rey Southwest for a huge selection of El Paso souvenirs, decor, and gifts. Mission Del Rey features El Paso saddle blanket products and thousands of Southwest, Native American, and Mexico items, plus unique pottery, blankets, and turquoise jewelry. Bring your family and out-of-town guests to visit Mission Del Rey Southwest's large showroom at Lee Trevino and Pelicano and see their website at missiondelrey.com. 915-440-2140 for souvenirs, gifts, and decor. Mission Del Rey Southwest. Pepe's New Mexican Restaurant and Cantina serves the old Griggs Mexican food recipes in a new location at 6761 Doniphan Drive. Enjoy great New Mexican food with cold beer and the one and only margarita from the cantina. The managers and cooks from the original Griggs restaurant serve tacos, combination plates, and sopapillas. Get the best Mexican food in the valley at Pepe's New Mexican Restaurant and Cantina, 6761 Doniphan near Loop 375. Call 877-2152. M1 EP Management Corporation is proud to sponsor the El Paso History Show. If you're tired of the ups and downs of the stock market, invest in real estate. M1 EP manages apartments in El Paso and helps investors buy, hold, and sell property. See the website,
Thank you all so very much for joining us here for the El Paso History Radio Show, airing on News Radio 690 KTSM. I'm your host, Andrew J. Polk. Thank you for tuning in however you may be doing so, be it on air, online, live, streaming through the free and reliable iHeartRadio app, or joining us over on the various social media pages, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, and Twitch, either under the El Paso History Radio Show, El Paso History TV, or related here. Starting on hour 2 of the program, as we usually do, talking about actually an interesting bit of moments here on one of the subjects we've talked about here, Ascarate Lake, and how there was specifically the seaplane landing in 1961.
A big U.S. Navy seaplane with pontoons made an emergency landing on Ascarate Lake in April of 1961. It was being flown from California to Galveston, Texas, and could only land on water. The pilots had engine trouble over Arizona and decided Ascarate Lake was their only option, so they dumped most of their fuel and made it to El Paso. As you might expect, it caused quite a stir. The area was closed while the aircraft circled and prepared to make a landing in the 3,000-foot-long lake. The pilot said, "The trouble started around Yuma, but it didn't get serious until we were 50 or 60 miles outside of El Paso." The pilot said it was decided to come to El Paso rather than try for Elephant Butte Lake. He said they were not in the least worried about landing on Ascarate Lake, but taking off again was another matter. The plane landed from south to north, then was towed to the north end of the lake with the assistance of a sheriff's department boat piloted by Deputy Charlie Barker and a county recreational department boat handled by Earl Thurston. Thousands of El Pasoans armed with cameras and field glasses lined the lake after police and sheriff's deputies reopened the park. Once the engine was repaired, takeoff was carefully planned a week later. The inside of the flying boat was stripped almost bare to lower its weight, and the ship carried a minimum load of gas and a small crew. Trees at the south end of the lake were soaked overnight and pushed over by a bulldozer to allow the easiest takeoff. 10 spectators stood by as the 77,000-pound seaplane made a quick run from the far northern end of the lake and then lifted into the air with a thundering roar and the flash of rocket boosters. It was the biggest ship ever to take off from the waters of Ascarate. Then everybody relaxed. They made it. I'm Jackson Polk with this history moment for the El Paso History Radio Show.
Of course, also want to mention some of our great partners in El Paso history work, including Barbara Given Bainey, operator of the great Facebook page, Remember in El Paso When. Go there for archive pictures galore. They have 33,000 members, but please remember, these administrators have worked hard in researching for photos with our history attached. When you use their photos, they ask that credit be given to the site here. So, of course, the people that are involved in that great effort in making sure that happens, including some newer names and newer faces, so to speak, that are also a part of it. We do have, of course, Chief Admin, owner, and historian Barbara Given Bainey, affectionately known as BGB, along with administrators Rick Nahara, Margaret D. Smith, Rick Duncan, and Jim Gerber, as well as moderators Ben Vincent and Dan Graves. Do appreciate their work, and they're always looking for a few more good hands in monitoring and managing such a page, because having a page with more than 33,000 members at last check is no mean feat, and it takes a lot of effort to do that. So if you're looking to assist in that way, always give them a shout out. Again, the Remember in El Paso When Facebook page and group. But again, joining us here in studio right now, we do have Dr. David Dorado Romo, El Paso historian, focused on the Borderlands and some of the US-Mexico interactions and histories and communities specifically. So we were talking a bit about Concordia and some of the related things, and also the Salt War, of which we did have a few other pictures, including some depictions of Camp Concordia as it existed at the time, as it was used as one of the building sites. There's more of a depiction, a relief drawing, and then actually a picture of one of the, at that point, aging buildings later on after the actual conflict, I do believe. But then, of course, some of the actual monuments that still exist out there in the Salt Flat areas, as well as the actual, well, mention about the preciousness of the resource there. So the Salt War was a significant bit of incident there, but also emblematic of in a lot of other ways of what happened around that, because it wasn't too long after that point in time that we saw more of the, again, political and then for military upheaval within Mexico itself when we got into the Mexican Revolution, as it's called from this side of here. Not necessarily the only time that there was armed conflict involving the government of Mexico here, but one of the times that it got close enough that the U.S. at that point in time, as it also existed, ended up being involved, or as they, well, not even just involved, but actively a participant in some of these battles, including more of the ones that we talked about previously, the last Battle of Juarez, in which U.S. troops actually crossed into Juarez outside of the punitive expedition. But the punitive expedition is another very significant example of U.S. involvement within that. But there's a lot more that you delve into there as well, right, David?
That's right. So going back to this idea of black and brown people being pitted against each other, I think the Mexican Revolution represents that. African-American soldiers during the punitive expedition, which takes place in 1916 after Pancho Villa attacks the United States in retaliation for the United States acknowledging the Carranza government, which
Pancho Villa was very much opposed to, and even some of the, it could be argued even before that point, maybe not active intervention, but active support of then the Carranza regime at that
for instance,
point.
They would allow the Carrancistas to use American railroads to go to specific battle points where the Villistas were trying to attack. And Villa felt very offended. He had always had good relations with the U.S. government and protected a lot of the American businesses, and Carranza had it. So he felt very betrayed. But getting back to the point that it was African Americans who were put at the forefront. And when you read the newspapers, some of them are just, some of the racism of the time is incredibly absurd. African Americans supposedly, because of their black skin, could tolerate the heat in the desert. And that's why they were sent to the forefront, right? I think that was a pretext. Once again, this is a prime example of one ethnic group being pitted against each other. And in the history of colonialism, you try to pit the same group against each other if possible. For instance, the Apaches that helped capture, the Apache scouts that joined the U.S. Army to help capture Geronimo in Mexico in the 1880s. And after Geronimo surrendered, both of them were put on a train and sent to a Florida prison camp, right? So that's just something that constantly happens, especially here on the borderlands. And it goes back a long, long period. So yes, African Americans are placed at the forefront. There's something called the Battle of Carrizal, where the African American soldiers were led into a part of Mexico that the Mexican government did not permit while they were chasing for Pancho Villa.
The punitive expedition we're talking
during
about
the
there.
punitive expedition of 1916. And so the Carrancista soldiers, the federal soldiers that were supposedly, they were the ones that gave permission to the U.S. to begin with, they end up shooting down and killing a lot of the African Americans. So the survivors come through El Paso. And at the end, the white community gives them a huge parade. And there's one little detail that I found kind of also a little ironic. At the end, one of the military officers brings the African American soldiers watermelons. And to me, that, watermelons was part of the stereotype of you guys like fried chicken and watermelons, right?
I mean, that's one of those modern conceptions of what was said at the time here. I mean, there's a lot of other phrases that also come up from that point in time that we cannot repeat on the radio, but
Right. So, but it was celebrated, the fact by the white community, the fact that the African Americans were showing their patriotism to white America by going in and trying to capture a Mexican revolutionary, right? But then soon after, probably less than a year, you have something happen to the 24th Infantry.
So the 24th Infantry does have its history in El Paso. Of course, it was stationed here, and at points and even later points in time, I believe we actually have the picture here of the 24th Infantry guarding El Paso. This was later on in 1919, and they were also one of the participants in the last Battle of Juarez, which we've talked about previously on the show. But prior to that, and this has actually been put into dramatic fashion a little bit more recently than specifically the 24th, I believe, is the name of the movie that came out in 2020 that actually talks about there's a lot of movement going on here. So just to lay it out again here, that we're talking about this infantry unit being part of the, again, punitive expedition into Mexico, coming through El Paso and those kind of things here, and then being removed back out and sent over to Houston. Then at that point in time, at 1917, and then the idea was them to be ready then to go off to World War I, which often it's really tempting to think of these as completely separate and not conjoined conflicts,
Right.
but they were going on at the same time. And that's one of the reasons that there was so much, as we talked about previously, like intrigue going on, particularly in our region, involving the Mexican Revolution, because by some, say, European powers, it was seen as a way to keep the U.S. occupied and maybe out and not as focused on that conflict. But again, so there was a lot of interplay going in there is what I'm getting at here. So
Right.
the fact that it was sent over to potentially be ready to go to and fight in World War I is part of where that story then begins.
Yes. So at that point, the African American soldiers had a lot of social capital, to use a modern phrase, in terms of, they had proved their patriotism, they had fought against Mexican revolutionaries, but remember that they were sent to the borderlands because basically there was less prejudice as well among brown people in the borderlands, and also also to create divisions among people who were former allies. And we just talked about during the Texas independent movements, it was Mexicans that were helping African Americans to escape into Mexico. So as soon as you go into Mexico, you're not segregated, right? Like there's Lady Flo is one of the wealthiest African Americans in El Paso, and she moved to what is now Ciudad Juarez in order not to have to face discrimination that she would face on this part, right? So you have that. You can just cross a simple...
That interplay at that point in time, yeah.
So what happens that a few of the 24th soldiers are sent to Houston. I think they were involved in the construction of the camp there.
It was again, the dramatization is one thing here, but some of the history of it actually is that, they were sent there and essentially, setting up their own camp and facilities, training.
Right.
It was still a segregated unit, obviously, black soldiers, white commanders, those kind of things as well,
Right.
very, very common at that point in time. And they were, again, ostensibly preparing to go to, again, World War I. So some slight uniform updatings here, the not quite doughboy uniforms, again, differences from the one that were in the punitive expedition. So there was that going on for it. But as much as, there was, of course, segregation in El Paso in a ways, but in a different way. Things are always differently locally here than they are in a lot of other places compared to Texas. But in Texas, Jim Crow and those kind of laws were very firmly, racial codes were very firmly in effect and very much enforced here. And honestly, there's a lot of times here, particularly even, talking about just after the Civil Wars we talked about, there's a lot of tension that could be seen about the idea of there being any amount of essentially armed black people, whether it be in official capacity or not here. And so that's
in other words, whites in Central Texas did not like to see African Americans in uniforms and carrying guns. And so here on the border, for instance, in the early part of the 20th century, and I don't remember, it was 1904, 1905, there was a small scale riot, and that was because a white officer had arrested an African American soldier from Fort Bliss, and there was a riot, but it was specifically and exclusively among the police force and the African American soldiers. In Houston, something very similar happened. That an African American was arrested, one of the sergeants, but in that case, you had the white population of Houston joining in on the riot. Here, the Mexican Americans, they don't care. That's between you guys. It's a black-white thing. It doesn't involve us. Even though we're technically white at that time, white by theory, we're really off-white because we're facing the same kind of discrimination.
Yeah, the race versus ethnicity kind of argument that still kind of exists in modern paperwork to this time here, honestly.
Right. So in Houston, you have a mob that's created that comes in and tries to take over the situation. And they basically want to lynch the African American soldiers. They get scared, they start shooting, and they end up killing, more than a dozen white people. I believe 17 white people.
Of those rioting at that point in time.
Those that of the what they perceived as a lynch mob, right? And the lynch mob perceived themselves as trying to, instill justice, what have you. So what happens? They're put on trial, but before they're put on trial, more than 100 of them, about 130 of them, were put in a military prison in the barracks here at Fort Bliss.
So transported back from Houston here to Fort Bliss at that point, because it was Fort Bliss at that point in time.
Right. And I guess through all kinds of coercion, psychological coercion, they forced one group of African American soldiers to basically accuse the others of having participated in that. They were the witnesses. They were forced to testify against each other, right? And who knows what kind of coercive techniques they used or not. I don't know. But that's what happened here in Fort Bliss, right? And at first, the local military wanted the trial to happen at Fort Bliss. For some reason, they sent it over to San Antonio. And you can see that picture, and to me, it's pretty dark. You can see just in the body language of the white officers kind of crossing their legs, and so this is a mass trial. That the night of the when the lynch mob came, it was very dark and it was cloudy, foggy. You wouldn't have been able to really ascertain who were the guilty parties involved, who shot into the crowd or not. But they managed to find 13 of them guilty, and so they were hung immediately. They were executed immediately after the trial of the verdict, and then they were just placed in unknown graves, unmarked graves. And that to me is the repetition of the same thing that happened with the Apache friendlies, the scouts, and capturing the unfriendlies, the hostile Apaches. And they were both put in a train and sent into Florida, right? That's the same principle, that even though African Americans were now the patriots immediately after the punitive expedition, this brings them back again to African Americans being questioned, their loyalty,
and the issues with potential, local and even national power structures at the time, they're being perceived as a threat in its own way here. So again, that's Dr. David Romo, El Paso historian, focused on the borderlands and different communities within it and hidden histories. Got to take that next break right now. So coming out of this break, talking a little bit more about that and kind of the juxtaposition, as well as some of the slightly more modern history, I guess you could say, here moving forward in time towards some of those communities and tours that will be happening of them here in our area. So stay tuned for more on the El Paso History Radio Show here on News Radio 690 KTSM.
You are listening to the El Paso History Radio Show, streaming on Facebook, where you can find archived radio programs. The El Paso History Radio Show also streams on the Facebook page Remember in El Paso When, run by Chief Administrator Barbara Gibbon-Bainey, known as BGB. Check out that page for thousands of archived pictures and videos of El Paso history. Remember in El Paso When on Facebook. Visit Mission Del Rey Southwest for a huge selection of El Paso souvenirs, decor, and gifts. Mission Del Rey features El Paso saddle blanket products and thousands of Southwest, Native American, and Mexico items, plus unique pottery, blankets, and turquoise jewelry. Bring your family and out-of-town guests to visit Mission Del Rey Southwest's large showroom at Lee Trevino and Pelicano, and see their website at missiondelrey.com. 915-440-2140 for souvenirs, gifts, and decor. Mission Del Rey Southwest. Pepe's New Mexican Restaurant and Cantina serves the old Griggs Mexican food recipes in a new location at 6761 Doniphan Drive. Enjoy great New Mexican food with cold beer and the one and only margarita from the cantina. The managers and cooks from the original Griggs restaurant serve tacos, combination plates, and sopapillas. Get the best Mexican food in the valley at Pepe's New Mexican Restaurant and Cantina, 6761 Doniphan, near Loop 375. Call 877-2152. M1 EP Management Corporation is proud to sponsor the El Paso History Show. If you're tired of the ups and downs of the stock market, invest in real estate. M1 EP manages apartments in El Paso and helps investors buy, hold, and sell property. See the website, m1ep.com. M1ep.com to learn more about the many benefits and law.
Thank you all so very much for joining us here for the El Paso History Radio Show, airing in this pre-recorded episode on News Radio 690 KTSM. I am your host, Andrew J. Polk. What we got coming up for you on the next program here for the end of the year. We'll be bringing you some of our great previous episodes of the show, some encore presentations, including some of the ones related to some of the major topics we have been discussing recently and, of course, coming up here. So next week, we're going to be revisiting the program that we had previous in the year with John Hamilton talking about that last Battle of Juarez. So that'll be coming up for you next week on the program, delving into the events and even the actual documentation that he was able to pull up of the after-action reports on that day here. So stay tuned for that. Of course, one more sponsor to remind you about. Mission Del Rey Southwest. Go there with out-of-town visitors for souvenirs, jewelry, gifts, or decor, or just go yourself with anyone that you know or like to get the literal flavor and decor of the Southwest here as well. They have a great selection of, most recently when I was there, they had some great cast aluminum patio furniture, which looks just like the cast iron stuff, but is much less likely to crush your foot. It's a lot lighter. But also some Native American jewelry and goods sourced from native creatives there, so if you want to see it, and also food items. So again, literal and figurative flavors there. You can find them, of course, online, missiondelrey.com. That's missiondelrey.com. They do ship around the country and across the world here. Or again, visit their 12,000 square foot showroom on Lee Trevino and Pelicano. Mention the El Paso History Radio Show for a discount. Again, that's 915-440-2140 to give them a call, 915-440-2140. But again, joining us here in studio right now, we do have Dr. David Dorado Romo, El Paso historian, and focus on the Borderlands and some of the communities and histories of it here. So I would just want to make a juxtaposition of what we were just talking about, the history of the 24th here, because it was that yes, part of the punitive expedition, and then as their experience in Houston went, resulting in the execution of a number of the soldiers there for the riots that happened related to their presence there, and then they were back in El Paso after that point here. So this isn't exactly them on parade. I believe this is the one of the second cavalry units that came through our region here, but showing where the parades at this point in time and around the Mexican Revolution were happening for on the U.S. side of things. This is just south of San Jacinto Plaza, so here's more of an aerial view without the trees, so it's not exactly a same comparison, but you can see the same boulevards happening there here. Again, what is now those parts of San Jacinto Plaza that was still right next to it, so you can kind of see if you've been down there recently what kind of area we're talking about here. But here was the 24th Infantry Unit as they came back to El Paso, guarding El Paso itself here, and then entering into Mexico during the last Battle of Juarez that happened there in 1919. So this very interesting back and forth and juxtaposition of both how, well, it kind of worked locally in a lot of similar, of course, laws were in place, though the community reaction may have been different on its own base level here, depending on what subset of the community we're talking about here. And then, of course, what happened with, again, the trial and the merits or lack thereof of it back in Houston.
Yeah, so there's a lot of back and forth, right? So you have immediately after 1916, whites throw this big parade with watermelons and everything at the end. And then you have 1917, where they execute a total of 19 African-American soldiers for basically defending themselves against the white mob. And then you have 1919, when they use them again at the forefront during the third battle of Ciudad Juarez, Pancho Villa attacks. And it was the African-Americans that go and give chase. They never caught Pancho Villa. No. He surrendered to the Mexican government, not to the U.S. government. And then you have 1921. There's another race massacre that was started by a lot of these African-American soldiers that had just come back from World War I and said, hey, we fought for this country. You're not going to treat us the same way. There was another lynch mob, and they tried to arm themselves. And the Tulsa massacre results in hundreds of African-Americans. We don't know the exact number. The Black Wall Street, as it was known, because it was one of them. It was an extremely thriving community. Was completely obliterated by that massacre.
And that has been dramatized its own way it's a little bit incongruous the way it's presented in a different series, the Watchmen series, that, right. It's an interesting way to dramatize it, though, just dramatically and thematically thinking, it's a weird way to put it into a pseudo superhero story. It was a little bit weird for me. I like both series and the talk about them, but just in the modern sense, that was just a little. I don't know if I would have picked that one to play that way.
It wasn't a history show. It was, they were using history to
framing of it for dramatic tension kind of thing, which is why I'm like, okay. But yes, but even beyond that, there was, of course, not necessarily the same type of incident talking about Tulsa there, but similar types of communities and setups that happen in our area, Black Wall Street, and of course across Alameda, which we'll be talking a little bit more about, and some tours coming up, but already got to take that next break here. Right. Short segment here, back after this break with more on the El Paso History Radio Show, continuing our discussion about, some of the hidden histories and the background that does inform our modern day. So stay tuned for more on the El Paso History Radio Show here on News Radio 690 KTSM.
You are listening to the El Paso History Radio Show, streaming on Facebook, where you can find archived radio programs. The El Paso History Radio Show also streams on the Facebook page Remember in El Paso When, run by Chief Administrator Barbara Gibbon-Bainey, known as BGB. Check out that page for thousands of archived pictures and videos of El Paso history. Remember in El Paso When on Facebook. Visit Mission Del Rey Southwest for a huge selection of El Paso souvenirs, decor, and gifts. Mission Del Rey features El Paso saddle blanket products and thousands of Southwest, Native American, and Mexico items, plus unique pottery, blankets, and turquoise jewelry. Bring your family and out-of-town guests to visit Mission Del Rey Southwest's large showroom at Lee Trevino and Pelicano and see their website at missiondelrey.com. 915-440-2140 for souvenirs, gifts, and decor. Mission Del Rey Southwest. Pepe's New Mexican Restaurant and Cantina serves the old Griggs Mexican food recipes in a new location at 6761 Doniphan Drive. Enjoy great New Mexican food with cold beer and the one and only margarita from the cantina. The managers and cooks from the original Griggs restaurant serve tacos, combination plates, and sopapillas. Get the best Mexican food in the valley at Pepe's New Mexican Restaurant and Cantina, 6761 Doniphan near Loop 375. Call 877-2152. M1 EP Management Corporation is proud to sponsor the El Paso History Show. If you're tired of the ups and downs of the stock market, invest in real estate. M1 EP manages apartments in El Paso and helps investors buy, hold, and sell property. See the website, m1ep.com. M1ep.com. To learn more about the many benefits and long-term appreciation, call 915-592-4549. 915-592-4549.
Many retired El Paso area homeowners don't know where to begin when it comes to downsizing and selling their home. Patrick Tuttle and his Legacy Home team follow a proven process to help retired homeowners sell faster and for more money. Call Patrick Tuttle at 915-588-1850 today and get your home sold faster and for more money. That's Patrick Tuttle at 915-588-1850. Call him today.
The El Paso History Radio Show also streams on Saturday mornings on our YouTube channel, El Paso History TV. Go to youtube.com/El Paso History TV for archives of the El Paso History Radio Show. Also on that YouTube channel, you can see for free many other videos, documentaries, and lectures about El Paso area history at youtube.com/El Paso History TV. Additionally, watch a dozen TV documentaries about El Paso history for free there on our YouTube channel. This includes Legends of El Paso's Mountains, Gunfights of the Old West, El Paso's Waco Tanks, Mexican Revolution sites in El Paso, and 8 more TV documentaries produced by El Paso filmmaker Jackson Polk since 2001. And at youtube.com/El Paso History TV, you can watch for free 20 short videos we produced that were broadcast on ABC7 KVIA TV newscasts. This series is called El Paso History TV and features Spanish missions and churches on El Paso's Mission Trail, plus the Guadalupe Mission in Juarez, Mexico. That church was built in 1659 and is the oldest known adobe building on the El Paso Juarez Valley. It still welcomes Catholic worshipers today. Go to El Paso History TV on youtube.com. You are listening to the El Paso History Radio Show streaming on Facebook.
Thank you all so very much for joining us here for the El Paso History Radio Show, airing in this pre-recorded segment on News Radio 690 KTSM. I am your host, Andrew J. Polk. Make sure to check out the original reporting only in El Paso Inc. that you'll find it this coming weekend. El Paso's business journal, El Paso Inc. is available for home or business delivery. Particularly check out their upcoming editions, including their El Pasoan of the Year, as well as their Sun Bowl edition. So a lot to look forward to as we reach the end of the year. Again, El Paso's business journal, El Paso Inc. is available for home or business delivery. To receive El Paso Inc. or get your digital subscription, like I often end up looking at it, order it online at elpasoinc.com. That's elpasoinc.com here. But of course, still joined here in studio by David Romo, El Paso historian, focused on the Borderlands and some of the communities within it here. So we've talked a lot about some of the kind of setting up both incidents, bits of history, and those kind of things, particularly in the South-Central El Paso area that you have been talking about. Mentioned a lot of those in the first segment of the program here in the first hour here, but some of those sites, as many of them may no longer be visible or totally, even if you find plaques and things, there are still a lot of sites, as you mentioned, particularly when we're talking about Paisano, Alameda, those corridors that do definitely still exist here, including some notable churches and schools, among other things, and they may have been both at certain points in time here, including the Douglas church, or the Douglas School, that also became a church and is still existence down there, a very recognizable, well, roofline, I'm just going to say.
Yeah, I don't know what kind of, I mean, it looks, I don't know, not Russian, It kind of reminds me.
I could see that being described as Orthodox in a way, even though Super wasn't an Orthodox church.
Right. It reminds me of Franklin School also. Franklin School had definitely kind of that onion dome-shaped kind of Russian Orthodox type of architecture. So that was right in the middle of the Segundo Barrio on 4th and Kansas, and it served as the school for African Americans, a segregated school for African Americans, until it moved to where it is today, Eucalyptus Street. So the Segundo Barrio is where most of the families, African American families, lived in the early part of the 20th century. So you had a church there on Virginia Street in South El Paso, the Second Baptist Church.
Right.
And that was built specifically as an African American church. You had a Black Masonic temple right next to it. Next to it. Now, unfortunately, there's an empty lot there.
Right.
For instance, Dr. Nixon. Dr. Nixon is one of the best-known civil rights leader of the local African American community for the voting rights that he pushed for, and successfully won at the U.S. Supreme Court.
Right.
And later, you have most of the black businesses in what was then East El Paso, today Central, on the Alameda Avenue zone. So we're talking about the 1930s and 1940s. So why? Part of it is that it was closer to Fort Bliss, but remember, Alameda was Highway 80. And that was the gateway to El Paso. So Highway 80 has its stories as fascinating as Highway 66, Route 66. So it came from Savannah, Georgia, all the way to San Diego. So you had a lot of the migration. You had the northern migration up to Chicago of the African American community.
Sure.
And other places. But you also have western migration. So a lot of the porters, the railroad porters, they would set up here. So they had already been living in Segundo Barrio and Duranguito as well, in what was known as the First Ward. That was also an integrated neighborhood. But Alameda Street has been described as the Black Wall Street, because you had all kinds of, if you read these green books, which are the travel guides where African Americans could stay and where they would not face segregation, you'll find several lodgings, you'll find restaurants that are integrated. There was a Black Elks Lodge there. There were record stores like Marvin Williams. He was the one that would bring in all the African American performers, these great performers like Dizzy Gillespie.
Right.
And the one that would come down here a lot was Fats Domino. So what happened is after they would play at the Coliseum, there was this performance space, this venue called Rusty's. And it was owned by an African American man who would bring in people like Fats Domino's and Chuck Berry and Little Richard, James Brown, like La Creme de la Creme. But he would also bring in mixed dances. So he would bring the mambo. It was a big, like the mambo, the Afro-Latino kind of rhythms. And so the people, the brown and black people that lived on that same area, and they were both, for instance, Guardian Angel was 1 block away from Rusty's, and there were like 700 students, Mexican American students at that one church. So it wasn't exactly like Black Wall Street in Tulsa, because that was predominantly and maybe almost exclusively African American.
Right.
Here it was black and brown. So that's what gives the border its different hues. So you have bands that are going like for instance, I have like this band, the Night Dreamers. So you see 4 Mexican American musicians playing with Sonny Powell and fellow singers. So Sonny's the one that's holding the microphone. And so during the 60s, they ruled the airwaves. So when Steve Krosno would bring in James Brown, they would play live for him, right? And later they so their style of rhythm and blues, I call it fronterizo rhythm and blues, because they had that kind of Latin sense. So they were in the what was his name? Dick Cavett's Top 10 show. So Sonny Powell was one of the first African Americans to sing in Spanish, and later he sung with Tejano band. So like only in El Paso are you going to have that kind of integration, right? So a lot of the Pachuco boogie blues was also the same thing. So today I posted something on my Facebook about one of the most famous Mexican-American Pachuco musicians from El Paso, Don Tosti.
I got to ask you, though, because this is one of those kind of starting to become urban legend kind of things, the phrase Pachuco. I mean, there's a lot of, when you look at it, when you do find it in history books and you end up things like the Zoot Suit riots and things like that, they end up being a lot associated with California. A lot of it end up being. But there's some discussion I've heard that was actually an origination here more locally.
Oh, yeah. No. At that time, the top scholars, and I'm talking like Yale University trained anthropologists, were already interviewing people, and I'm talking about the 1940s, and they were asking their informants, where did the Pachucos come from? And they all said El Paso, all of them, even the Los Angeles at that time. Now it's forgotten history, right? Because Hollywood, the Zoot Suit movie, the play, they don't even mention the fact that Chuco was the name that the Pachucos gave to the city, El Chuco. So to go Pal Chuco is it's an abbreviation of Para Pal Chuco. So that comes from Pachuco. Where are you going? I'm going to the Chuco. Me voy pal Chuco.
Yeah.
And you'll see some of the 1940s, you have the newspaper saying Pachuco means I'm from El Paso.
Right.
And that part is totally forgotten. So the Pachucos swing and jitterbug and all of that. Cap Calloway was wearing the suit, and so were they.
Right.
And they were getting it from the fifis from Mexico, but they were also getting it from the jazz musicians. So jazz music was the music of the underground. That was the street music, right?
Right.
So when Don Tosti combines jump blues with swing and some mambo and these Afro-Latino rhythms, he is playing what he hears in the streets of El Paso. And Segundo Barrio and Alameda Street, you had la creme de la creme,
And different performance venues as well, including some theaters that can still kind of be seen out there. I got the picture up here.
So this is the old Lincoln Center that was done that was turned into an exclusively not segregated, but it was primarily an African American theater called the Lincoln Theater. And the very first movie that they showed was the Brown Bomber about Joe Louis and his fight against Max Schmeling during at that time period, the German boxer.
Right.
And you have others like this one, more or less at the same period. It was the Mission Theater, and it's still there today.
Right.
And at that time, it was done in this Spanish fantasy heritage style because there was the women's chapter of the Paso del Norte. The Chamber of Commerce wanted to turn all those buildings, and you can see kind of the red tile on top of like a building like this one. That used to be an African American church. That later, in 1926, it was an African American church. And by 1936, it had become a Pentecostal church, Assemblies of God, a Mexican Pentecostal church. So you see, even the churches, so you go from one ethnicity to the other, literally the same buildings, right?
Yeah.
And so what's very interesting is this Spanish fantasy heritage type of architecture that's being used all along Alameda, but it was, somebody described it as Mexican as you can get without including the Mexicans in the decision-making process, right? It was It was not really Mexican. It was kind of the Anglo vision of what you think Mexican architecture is. But anyway, that's a whole other chapter. But the point here is that Alameda Street creates this vibrant, underground, hidden story of collaboration despite all the attempts to pit the two communities against each other. And that was the black-brown Wall Street of El Paso at that time.
Again, David Romo here, El Paso historian, talking about these aspects of the hidden history. Got to take that last break before coming to the last segment right now, because there's also ways you can go out and see this, not just try to find it for yourself, but an upcoming tour. We'll talk about that and close out the show coming back from this next segment, so stay tuned for more on the El Paso History Radio Show here on News Radio 690 KTSM.
You are listening to the El Paso History Radio Show, streaming on Facebook, where you can find archived radio programs. The El Paso History Radio Show also streams on the Facebook page Remember in El Paso When, run by Chief Administrator Barbara Gibbon-Bainey, known as BGB. Check out that page for thousands of archived pictures and videos of El Paso history. Remember in El Paso When on Facebook. Visit Mission Del Rey Southwest for a huge selection of El Paso souvenirs, decor, and gifts. Mission Del Rey features El Paso saddle blanket products and thousands of Southwest, Native American, and Mexico items, plus unique pottery, blankets, and turquoise jewelry. Bring your family and out-of-town guests to visit Mission Del Rey Southwest's large showroom at Lee Trevino and Pelicano and see their website at missiondelrey.com. 915-440-2140 for souvenirs, gifts, and decor. Mission Del Rey Southwest. Pepe's New Mexican Restaurant and Cantina serves the old Griggs Mexican food recipes in a new location at 6761 Doniphan Drive. Enjoy great New Mexican food with cold beer and the one and only margarita from the cantina. The managers and cooks from the original Griggs restaurant serve tacos, combination plates, and sopapillas. Get the best Mexican food in the valley at Pepe's New Mexican Restaurant and Cantina, 6761 Doniphan, near Loop 375. Call 877-2152. M1 EP Management Corporation is proud to sponsor the El Paso History Show. If you're tired of the ups and downs of the stock market, invest in real estate. M1 EP manages apartments in El Paso and helps investors buy, hold, and sell property.
Thank you all so very much for joining us here for the El Paso History Radio Show, airing in this pre-recorded episode on News Radio 690 KTSM. Again, still joined here in studio by David Romo, El Paso historian, focused on some of these hidden histories that we've been having a lot of in-depth discussion about this portion of the show here. But it's not just so much an academic discussion about what has happened, but of the places that still exist and even the areas that can still be marked as being significant to these parts of history. You all will be having a tour of that coming up early-ish in the coming year, right?
That's right. On January 14th, we're going to meet at the Coliseum, at the County Coliseum at 9:30 in the morning, and have a short lecture presentation before we get on the bus and go to these different sites. So we'll start at the Coliseum itself, which, as I talked about, was an important site of a struggle against segregation, and that was both both from the Mexican American and African American community. And then we're going to go to different sites along Alameda. Many of the ones that I just showed, we're going to visit the home of Dr. Nixon and his wife, Priscilla Nixon, who was also an important figure in the local civil rights movement. And then we'll go down to Segundo Barrio, where we'll visit the home of Henry Flipper, the first graduate of West Point. And probably... there's another important site that people don't know about, and that's the Union Depot, the railroad station.
Oh,
that
yeah.
originally belonged to William Henderson, who was an African-American Pony Express and an Indian agent, as they called it back then. So a lot of sites. I won't give you all of them, but I
Got to go on the
it's gonna-
tour, of course.
Yeah, I think it's going to be fun and interesting.
And so how is this tour being organized?
So the El Paso County Commissioners have created a project called Corazón, Historia y Raíces, and that explores the hidden histories of South-Central El Paso. And it's really a project that's very well supported, especially by County Commissioner David Stout, and that's his district.
Right.
And so I'm the consultant for that, and I'm the tour guide, the exhibit coordinator. You know, I have different hats on that one. But they're doing tremendous work in trying to bring out these hidden histories, and hopefully it'll be something that we continue doing, just like the county also sponsors these bus tours in the Mission District.
Right.
Well, we don't have to go that far.
Yeah.
Right here. There's a lot of history here in the streets around us.
Absolutely. I mean, steeped in it would be an understatement in my mind here, in all the different ways here. And again, a phrase that keeps coming to mind whenever we talk about these things here is that there's a tendency within history for it to be, aggrandized and to focus on the triumphant aspects of it here. But a phrase I keep coming back to is that if history only ever makes you proud, you're probably not studying history, because as much as we as a culture and a society love stories, we love narratives, we love a nice, concise way of understanding something, because it's how we understand and maneuver through the world here. And there are certain rules of fiction, or even our narratization of what is reality, in that it has to meet, if it doesn't make sense, we don't like it, it's not digestible for us in an easy manner. Reality has no such restrictions on it. I mean,
Right.
Truth is always stranger than fiction, because fiction has to follow rules, and reality doesn't. Reality does whatever actually happened. And yeah, there's often confusing or baffling things that have happened in history that are just facts of the matter, and not necessarily
you
fitting
have
into
to
it.
study. You have to study both the good and the bad, because that And plus, it's more interesting, you know. If you just whitewash it and create some mythology that everything was, you know, hunky dory, it's just boring. I mean, I think conflict is what makes drama and novels and movies.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. If it
even
was
more interesting,
if it was one big kumbaya fest, then yeah, that would be a very short and boring movie.
So I think we got to tell both the good and the bad. You know, it's not about being boosters or what have you. It's about like really exploring stuff that's very relevant, because unfortunately history often repeats itself.
Yeah, and corollary phrase to that, I mean, I know there's the phrase out there that those who don't study history are doomed to repeat it, but then the corollary phrase is those who do study history are doomed to watch everyone else repeat it here.
And then the other one is that the one thing that history teaches us is that history repeats itself.
That is very true as well, and why it's worthy of talking about. And we do that every Saturday, 10 to noon here on News Radio 690 KTSM. I've been your host, Andrew J. Polk. Thanks again to our guest for this program here, Dr. David Dorado Romo, El Paso historian. Thank you very much for talking to us about these aspects and the upcoming tour for some parts of El Paso history.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for the invitation.
Absolutely, and thank you all very much for joining us here for the El Paso History Radio Show. I've been your host, Andrew J. Polk. We will see you all next week. Have a great one.
You are listening to the El Paso History Radio Show, streaming on Facebook, where you can find archived radio programs. The El Paso History Radio Show also streams on the Facebook page Remember in El Paso When, run by Chief Administrator Barbara Gibbon-Bainey, known as BGB. Check out that page for thousands of archived pictures and videos of El Paso history. Remember in El Paso When on Facebook. Visit Mission Del Rey Southwest for a huge selection of El Paso souvenirs, decor, and gifts. Mission Del Rey features El Paso saddle blanket products and thousands of Southwest, Native American,